Good morning, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining us this morning for this short webinar where we'd like to present to you the new report around battery recycling materials that we published yesterday, as well as to have a discussion with an expert from one of Europe's largest recycling company, as well as answer some of your questions. I'm Julia and I'm Senior Director with TNE, and it's really my pleasure to spend the next 45 minutes or so jointly with you. Before we kick off, just a quick reminder about a few housekeeping rules. First and foremost, this webinar is recorded, so you're all aware. Secondly, and lastly, please do use a Q&A button that you can see, which is where you can pose some of your questions, which my colleague Francisca will later look at and pose to some of us here during the Q&A session. So we will now kick off the webinar part, the content part of this webinar. What we will do is, first of all, spend the next 15 or 20 minutes or so presenting to you the main findings of the report, which I will do, after which we'll have a Q&A with Ruth Lambrechts, who is Director of Government Affairs for Umicore, and then spend the last 10 minutes having a broader Q&A on any questions that you might have. So without further ado, let me kick off with first and foremost presenting to you the main findings and insights from the recycling report that we published yesterday. I am aware that when we do these webinars, a lot of you really ask a lot of questions trying to understand what methodologies we do. So before presenting any findings, I'd really like just to transparently outline some of the main methodology assumptions and parameters that we use to derive the findings. But I really want to stress that the report is available on our website, and all of the information around underlying assumptions can be found in the annex and throughout the report. So first and foremost, just to let you know that the focus of our report, when we say Europe, we do include the UK in our estimations. We as TNE, a European organization beyond Brussels, we do have offices in main European capitals, including Paris, Berlin, Madrid, Rome, and London. So we do look at the UK and not only EU27. So what are some of the core assumptions? First of all, end of life. When we look at end of life electric vehicles, so batteries in our report, we do assume 100% collection rate. This is what's implied in the European battery regulation. We know that this is a challenge, and we as TNE are working on policies and want to work more on policies to secure that. But it does mean that a lot of our findings in the report are really the potential. It shows the potential of what can be achieved as opposed to a crystal ball of what exactly will happen in 2030 or 2040, as no one can do that. When it comes to EV batteries, we assume lifespan of up to 20 years, but the average we take is around 12 years, which is aligned with what the European Automobile Association often uses. And as we move to the mass market of EVs with more cheaper mass market models coming, we believe that this is a reasonable assumption. We also do assume some second life, actually quite a lot of second life. We assume that at least 70% of LFP batteries in our forecast and 40% of NMC batteries do stay in second life applications for 5 years. When it comes to storage, which is also part of feedstock we include here, we assume their lifespan on average of 10 years. We don't only look at end of life, lithium-ion batteries from end of life, electric cars, and energy storage. We do include production scrap on the many European battery gigafactories that are coming online. Here we're using our in-house gigafactory mapping model and realistic European ramp-up rates, and we do update that model regularly based on what's happening when projects are cancelled or delayed. Recovery rates are all based on the maximum found in the European battery regulation. We assume that companies will be achieving them after 2030. And the data sources that we use in all our assumptions, you can find here on the website, on the slide, mentioned. So Bloomberg, Circle Energy Storage, Minviro, and ourselves. So this is what's at the core of all of the findings. I will tell you later, and hopefully it can avoid some of the many questions we usually receive trying to understand this basics. So let's first look briefly at the main findings. Then we on the amount, on the volumes of materials we can actually have given all of this. We then will look at what this means and what opportunity and potential it is in Europe in terms of, for example, electric vehicle manufacturing, and finally look at some of the challenges achieving this potential and what role the policy plays in all of this. One main thing that we're looking at the report and what is really clear is that more and more feedstock, so local available materials for recycling, are entering streams in Europe. So first of all, here you can see the results for lithium. So if we take into account end-of-life batteries from storage and EVs and manufacturing scrap from factories, Europe can actually secure around 14% of its lithium demand for the future energy storage and EV applications by 2030. So it is quite considerate, given that lithium is one of those harder materials to find. So lithium around 14% by 2030 and more after. Then let's look at nickel. Nickel is also growing. So in nickel, by 2030, we see that 16% of our demand in Europe can be met with locally recycled available feedstock, rising to 25% by 2040. And on the y-axis on all slides, you can also see those volumes in kilotons. We also looked at cobalt, so we really cover most major battery materials in our work. And for cobalt, the results are even more impressive. This is understandable, as many battery chemistries today, notably NMC, is really reducing or even fully eliminating the use of cobalt, while we're also moving more and more to LFP, so chemistries without cobalt at all. So in the case of cobalt, a quarter of all our needs for lithium-ion storage and EV batteries can come locally by 2030, rising to almost 60% by 2040. So a really impressive volumes there. And finally, manganese. Manganese is really interesting. So yes, more and more can also come from recycling. So by 2030, around 17% of manganese can come from locally recycled feedstock. However, it's interesting that in the 2030s, that share is likely to decrease. And this is because the demand for manganese in batteries, given changes to chemistry, so more manganese-rich chemistries, for example, LFMP, are coming and becoming more popular, and that's why we will require, in some of the assumptions we take, more and more manganese. For example, those assumptions that are expected by Bloomberg New Energy Finance. So this is the amount of feedstock, growing feedstock available in Europe. So you can see it's a real opportunity. And in many cases is actually above, interestingly, the 10% mining benchmark that can be found in the Critical Raw Materials Act. So more can come from local recycling or urban mines in Europe than expected from or desired from primary mining. As a next thing in our report, we then look at whether or not that locally available feedstock is enough to meet some of the core recycled content targets in Europe. And we see that the answer is a resounding yes. So when we look at lithium, you see the graph here, the blue horizontal line is actually the recycled content target as agreed in the battery regulation. So you see that it's a bit lower in the early 2030s, and then it rises to 6% after 2036. And you can also see that the local feedstock available for recycling would be enough to meet the target. You can see the same situation for nickel, where we do have a higher recycled content target, as you can see here. So it actually rises, it rises significantly to about 9% from 2036. And again, you see that there will be enough locally available feedstock for recycling to meet that. And a similar story can also be said for cobalt, where we also have recycled content targets. Again, enough locally sourced feedstock for recycling. This is an important finding. It does show that if we capture the opportunity and recycle the materials we can in Europe, we can locally meet recycled content targets, meaning we don't have to import recycled material from abroad, creating, of course, an unnecessary disincentive and not being in line with what the regulation originally had in mind. You can also see that in many cases, the available feedstock is way above the minimum recycled content targets. So there is enough of a buffer if some of our assumptions, for example, are on the positive side. So battery regulation recycling content targets is another area we have looked at. As a next step, then, having looked at the available volumes, let's have a look at what this opportunity means. So what can we really do with this recycled material, recycled battery material? It's really a core finding of our report, what you see here on your slide. What we have analyzed is how many electric cars produced in Europe locally can be actually fully met by the volumes of recycled materials. And what you see is, I believe, and I find them really, really impressive findings. So already in 2030, as anywhere between 1.3 and over 2 million electric cars can be manufactured with locally recycled materials. It depends by material, of course. So it's lower for lithium, 1.3 million, and the highest number in all cases is for cobalt. You can also see, just so you have a bit of a comparison, how it compares to the overall electric cars, new electric cars sold in that year in Europe, based on the European car CO2 standards. This rises significantly by 2035. So by 2035, anywhere between 2 and 10 million electric cars can be produced with locally recycled materials. And then by 2040, this is really significant. In the case of cobalt, is as much as 15.4 million, which is almost all electric cars that we assume would be actually sold in Europe. So almost by 2040, we assume all sales to be electric, and all of them can be actually met with locally recycled materials in the case of cobalt, and close to half, for example, in the case of nickel. So quite an impressive industrial opportunity in Europe to really produce and source materials locally, not relying on imports. Another thing we've looked at is, given all of this feedstock, how many new mines we do not have to build as a result of that. And you can see findings here. So you could see that by 2040, a dozen of new mines, including 4 for lithium and around 4 for cobalt, if we take average size of mines today, will not have to be built. This is saving around 40 megatons of metal, so of mined ores, which is a really significant amount, and it's a lot of mining waste, for example, or tailings, that we can forego in that situation and avoid in releasing into our environment. So again, an interesting finding here. And finally, when we talk about the impacts, before I move to the challenges and the policy, finally, we also have looked at the life cycle greenhouse gas benefits of recycling. For this report, we've asked Minviro to specifically look at the case of lithium hydroxide, to be precise. But we do in the future plan to look at a lot more, by the way. So we'll probably look at nickel next year, etc. And there are, of course, various concerns also with recycling and also opportunities on reducing that. But if we take things as they are today, and if we compare lithium hydroxide, which is first of all extracted in Australia from spodumene and then processed in China into lithium hydroxide, then compared to that, recycling NMC 811 pack within that and lithium within that in Europe, based on the current grid, would save around a fifth, or 19% to be precise, of overall life cycle CO2 emissions. This is based on the current assumptions. Of course, if in Europe we were recycling, for example, fully with renewable energy, the results would be even better. And as I said, this is something we'll be looking more at these impacts next year. So far, so good. I think what you get so far is that this potentially can be a huge opportunity in Europe. But if there is one overall finding I want you to retain from this presentation, our report, is that while the opportunity is huge, today we are not fully capturing it. It is not actually happening in the real world yet due to a number of obstacles. And this is what we've also done in our report, and this is what I will move on to next. So while the recycling opportunity is there, we do not, as of yet today, have enough recycling capacity of factories to recover those materials in Europe. Within recycling, to be very simple, you would broadly have two processes. The first one is reprocessing, where you get the battery, you discard it, you discharge it, you shred it, so it's ready for the actual recycling, or what you would call as the second process, which is material recovery. And when we look at our capacities for material recovery, we see that today, where we are more or less 5 years ahead of 2030, we are 10 times below what the feedstock would be in Europe in 2030. Yes, we do have some material recovery. Companies like Umicore are chief among them that already recycle lithium-ion batteries in Europe, for example, in Belgium, where I am based. But generally, looking all across Europe, what we have today as factories are nowhere near where we need to be in 2030. And as we scale that, we do see many plans. So we, in our analysis, do show that theoretically, plans at all the different stages of maturity are there, but a lot of them have been at risk or slow. And the reasons for that are manifold. For example, one of the core reasons, if we look at today, is the fact that OPEX, or generally operational costs in Europe, are significantly higher than they are in China. In China, where you, of course, today already have a developed battery value chain, but you also have just lower input costs. So, for example, when we compare, as we do in our report, an OPEX of recycling an NMC 811 battery in Europe versus China, the cost gap is 25%. However, when we compare the LFP, which is the vast majority of batteries produced in China, the cost gap for that is actually a lot higher, and it is 56%. Some of the core reasons for that are higher costs for electricity, for utilities or services, as well as labor. For example, just looking at energy, the energy difference is 60%. So the energy costs are 60% higher in Europe when you look at the recycling needs. And of course, that is something that, without addressing, would make it harder to make recycling competitive in Europe. There are other reasons why it's today in Europe we experience slower than wanted ramp up of recycling facilities. Beyond cost, there are some technology challenges, for example, a lack of mature hydromet expertise in some cases. In many cases, as I showcased before, because of higher OPEX costs, the problem is that we do have, or rather lack in Europe, do not have enough of ramp-up industrial support in our financial instruments. So I had the pleasure to actually be on a circularity panel during the European Raw Materials Week yesterday, and we did have a representative from the EIB, European Investment Bank, who was showing the various mechanisms they have today to support recycling, but we still see that even within that, the actual tools, financial tools aimed at scaling, at the ramp-up, not R&D or first-of-class projects are really, really missing. There's also a lot of different rules and regulations that also prevent faster scaling in Europe, and we will spend a lot more time in the second half of this webinar delving into that with an expert. So as a result of all of these different obstacles, the story is, which you can see here as a slide, is that while we have enough plans, we have a number of plans announced, which are even, above the minimum feedstock we'd have in Europe by 2030. A vast amount of those projects are either on hold or less likely to go ahead. So they're in less mature stages, they're experiencing various delays and various scaling issues. So that means that without the additional policy and political support, we are unlikely to see recycling facilities in Europe which are sufficient for the opportunity of getting metals from recycling that we have. So it would be a real missed opportunity from Europe not capturing the resources that we have, that would instead go in China and come back as an electric vehicle. So what are some of those policies that we need in Europe to really make sure that we capture this opportunity? The most important message is that we need to act quick. We're missing out and we're being too slow. And here, one thing that really quite often strikes me as surprising is that we often talk about recycling and circularity broader. There's, of course, a number of other things that are important within circularity as just an environmental policy. There's plenty of environmental laws, targets, and many NGOs working on that. We never treat it as another industry. It's an industry like any other clean tech, and it needs industrial policy to scale. And that's how we hope the new European Commission and the new set of politicians in Brussels starts treating recycling. It's not an environmental add-on, it's an industrial policy. It's manufacturing that needs to happen. So in terms of more precise recommendations, beyond treating it as a clean tech, some of the specific things we want to see. We would like the European Commission, now that they have over 170 strategic projects under Critical Raw Materials Act, to prioritize integrated recyclers that do material recovery in Europe. So not just pre-processing, I mentioned before, but really recovering those metals up to battery grade material, be it lithium hydroxide or nickel sulfate, etc., that can really go into precursor and cathode production directly. So that's really important, because that's how we can also help with permitting, with finance, etc., to scale those projects in Europe. Another opportunity in Europe is the Circular Economy Act. In our view, the Circular Economy Act should not be just about new targets or new requirements, but it should really be about turning different European member states into one recycling single market. Something Enrico Letta also mentions in his fantastic report on the single market, that we're really missing the circular single market, and that's where we're missing some of the scaling opportunities. Most notable among them is to simplify the transportation rules within the EU. Of course, we're aware of the waste framework, waste shipment regulation, which is new, but it's not yet enough. And there's still some things that the Commission can do to scale this further. I talked a lot about high operational costs, and that's why it's really, really important that we do prioritize projects around material recovery within the different financial streams that we have in Europe. European Investment Bank can do a lot to de-risk some of this, but we also have InvestEU that can provide various guarantees, and of course the Innovation Fund, that we want to move away from just supporting R&D and as much as possible providing output-based ramp-up or scale-up finance support to really set and help those local recycling facilities. And finally, a big topic in any conversation about recycling, certainly in Europe today, is black mass. So the mix of materials such as cobalt, nickel, manganese, and lithium that you get after your initial pre-processing. It's black, so it's called black mass. And here, up until recently, we had a bit of a chicken and egg problem, whereby even though we had plans here in Europe to recover that black mass, we were struggling to secure the feedstock to do that, because it was often going to places like South Korea or China, where it would be turned into the battery value chain there and recycled there. And it's something that finally the Commission is now putting a stop to, which we really support. So we now do have new waste codes for end-of-life lithium batteries and intermediate or black mass products. And we treat them as hazardous, which means that we cannot export them to non-OECD countries. So it's a very welcome part of this puzzle. It won't solve all the problems on its own, but it's a really good start to incentivize more feedstock to stay locally. What we need to do next is to make sure that this actually happens, and the member states really quite strictly survey what is actually happening on their borders and make sure that there are no illegal exports. But of course, if we keep the feedstock here, we should also at the same time scale the facilities that can provide the offtake for that feedstock. And this is why all the previous recommendations are so important, because it needs to be at the same time we scale the capacities, we can't miss that opportunity, and at the same time we keep the feedstock, and it comes together and creates this value chain here. So this is a summary of most findings and insights, as well as policy recommendations that you can find in our report. So thanks very much. And I hope that you will read the report and please let us know if you have any questions. And now, as a next step, I will stop sharing my slides, and I would like to invite Ruth to join me on this online stage. So Ruth is Director of Global Public Affairs at Umicore. And one of the first questions that I want to start with to kick off the discussion is to just give you an opportunity to comment on the report. What do you think about the report, and why do you think we're not seeing a lot more recycling facilities scaling in Europe?
Thank you, Julia. Thank you also for the opportunity to say a few words on behalf of Umicore. Actually, I would say that the last slide that you showed, it could be a slide of Umicore. It could definitely be the same messages that we bring. So the report is very good, and it has a lot of good insights and good messages. I think maybe one of the things, and you mentioned, of course, at the end, is also the CapEx investments. So as you know, but I will briefly touch upon, Umicore has already for 15 years experience in battery recycling. We actually have in Antwerp already quite a big factory. It's an industrial pilot plant where we recover battery waste, not only from EVs, but from different types of batteries, which probably in the figures of TNE already makes the majority of the current capacity. But we want to build a gigafactory, and as you know, and as many plans of many players in the industry, this plan has been delayed with a few years. And why is that? Because first of all, you need to do a very big capex intensive investment, but the big amount of flows of end-of-life vehicles will only be available within 10-15 years, and of course, with the slowdown of EV uptake, this might be even delayed more. So there is some uncertainty, and also just the fact that you have to bridge this capex cost for something that will only be needed maybe in the next couple of years, but you need to do the investment now because you have production scrap that you want to recover the critical raw materials. That is something where we would say we need funding. We need also capex support. Definitely, if you look at the comparison with competition from elsewhere, and that brings me also to the second point: why is it not happening yet, or why are investments in the entire battery value chain, I would say, of course, being delayed or on hold by other players? That is, of course, because there is already quite some capacities in other parts of the world. Of course, in China, I think that is clear, and that was already also part of investigations by the European Commission. And that also means that as Europe, we also need to have a very stricter policy, a more, I would say, bold policy, and your recommendations are definitely in line with that. So I think, yeah, China, capex intensity of the investments while the feedstock is only available, that are some of the things why it is not happening at the scale that we wanted, or that's also you refer to in the report. If we compare these two, and I think that is one of the main questions that we get as a company, is, and I would say it's the big challenge, and you raised it, it's that battery waste, not only black mass, but battery waste in general is being exported, mainly also to China. For the moment, this was, of course, because black mass and battery waste did not have yet a specific waste classification, so it could be exported as a product. Just also because your T&E, transport and environment, we do not agree with that as Umicore. It is a hazardous waste. So the fact that some member states are able, I don't know, in a legal way to classify it as a product and not as a hazardous waste, I think that already raises some question marks. But also, and maybe we can touch upon it later on, the new legislation, the fact that the Commission has proposed to classify it as a hazardous waste. We really wonder whether this is enough, because I think your report really highlighted the differences also in OPEX cost. So any loophole that can be found to still export battery waste outside of Europe will be taken with these cost differences. So the export controls for hazardous waste, the list of waste, if it's of course if everybody classifies it in the right way, if there is enough enforcement also, if we revise also the currently given product authorizations for black mass in member states, so something that is given should then be revised. So all these things, we really wonder whether that is enough. And our proposal would even be that for this specific industry, so battery recycling, that we maybe go a bit further and that we look at a temporary export ban of all battery waste, just to avoid the fact that you might do some, I think it was another company that once raised that you do some waste tourism. You send a waste stream to a country where it is allowed through the European waste shipment regulation, you do an intermediate step in that country, and then you export it to a country, and you don't know in which conditions it will be recycled, but in how it will be lost for our value chain. So it is not something that we as a company, as a multinational company, normally say, but for waste and for battery waste, I think we have a very specific case that we really need to do everything in the next couple of years to keep it in Europe, because it will be very crucial to define the business case of the investments that you raised that need to happen in Europe.
Yes, thanks. Thank you so much for this very, very comprehensive answer. I was about to ask you, so what should be done beyond defining it hazardous waste? And I think you already answered that question very well. Just to very briefly add, from the perspective of TNE, we also support simply more blunt, stricter export controls and export ban to make sure that this feedstock stays in Europe. So absolutely. And I think we just need to look a bit more into legal implications on how this can be done. And that does not stop at black mass and batteries. We have similar issues with, for example, aluminium scrap, steel scrap. It's just really a pan-European problem that we're losing our materials and then we're importing them from elsewhere. The other bigger question I wanted to ask you was about transportation rules across Europe of end-of-life batteries and black mass. I quite often hear from people who are in this business and have experienced that today it's more complicated to ship end-of-life batteries between Germany and Hungary than it is to simply ship it to China. However, when I mention this to our policymakers, the answer quite often is, we've solved it all in the waste shipment regulation. So talk us through this, as I know you're really an expert in this. What is the problem? What is needed? And why the waste shipment regulation is still not enough?
Yeah, yes. Waste shipment regulation. I must admit that when I joined Umicore 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, it was also something new for me, like waste legislation. And I think that is exactly the problem. So in general, waste shipments, it's a global convention. The idea is that before you can ship a waste, and especially a hazardous waste, from one country to another country, you have to get the permit from the country of export, the country of destination, and all transit countries in between. That's at a global level, but also within the EU, this applies. And there are only a handful of countries in the EU that already do something like tacit consent, so that they say, yeah, when it's just transiting our country, it is okay. Or for instance, when it's not unloaded from the truck or unloaded from the ship, it is okay. And I think that is already something we must be able to improve, that when we have defined what are state-of-the-art, best-in-class recycling facilities, it must be able to get a faster permit, a faster track, and to avoid all this red tape that is in between, because it's not only delaying the actual recycling, because then the waste needs to be piled before it can be loaded on the truck, because you need all the paperwork beforehand. It might even be easier than to ship it outside of Europe. That is, of course, something that is going to change with the new list of waste and the waste shipment regulation, where you will always also have to do it through a sort of permit or a sort of audit. But there are many member states in Europe, and just the fact that you have to do this permit, that's one step. Another example is you also, member states also ask a financial guarantee. But this financial guarantee, if you look at other waste streams, we are also active in other recycling activities, for instance, precious metals, then it's a big bulk of printed circuits board, for instance, it's a big batch. You can do it for this kind of batch. But for end-of-life vehicles, so end-of-life batteries, you can imagine that if we have to do a financial guarantee for each and single end-of-life battery or end-of-life battery batch coming from a collector or coming from a garage, let's say, then we have a lot of paperwork. They're also calculated differently. So also this is something, do we really need it? Maybe we do. Maybe we do for some types of waste, like plastics and textiles. Maybe we also do it because not everyone is doing it in the right circumstances. But for the companies that have the good recycling facilities, that recover the critical raw materials in an environmental sound manner, it should be able to get a faster permit. So, and I remember a few years ago that I raised this in a meeting, or it was maybe only a year ago, that I said, it was on a waste shipment expert group. I said, but what are you going to do to really create this single market of waste? Because this was an idea that was already mentioned, I think, once at that time. And then somebody from the member state said, yeah, but dear, this is environmental legislation here. We're not talking about industrial policy or economy. This is only environmental legislation. And I think that is exactly what needs to change. It is environmental legislation, it is hazardous waste, but it is also critical raw materials. And if we do not have a more streamlined procedure within the EU, we risk that it gets stockpiled or that it gets converted into an intermediate and an MHP product, for instance, and then we get lost of it because it will be shipped outside of Europe. So we are really glad that this single circular economy act has been announced. Political guidelines of President von der Leyen also mentioned a single market of waste, especially for secondary critical raw materials. So it could have been written also by us and probably also by TNE, but now we need to make it work. And that makes that we also need to have all member states on board. That we, for instance, on this automatic tacit concept, when it's just a shipment in transit, we do not have to wait for the paperwork from every single authority. Also, digitalization. Now, can you imagine that if we ship dismantled battery waste from our plant in Hanau to our plant in Belgium, that sometimes we need to wait for a fax. So we need to have the permit via fax, or not even via email. That is also something that is going to change with the new waste shipment regulation, but many of these provisions are only applicable within a few years. And there is a European digital platform that will be developed for that, which is great. We support it, but we must also make sure that it's coupled with customs legislation. Exactly, again, for this higher concern, I would say, that's the export. If we have a good correspondence between waste codes, customs codes, but if we also have enough means, also from anti-fraud offices, etc., to make sure that we really track these flows, then we might have something that is really, really, really working. I think, and maybe it's also something that is mentioned as part of the Circular Economy Act, and you also raised it. It's the recycled content targets, and I think your report shows, yes, European recycles can do it. We can reach these recycled content targets, but in general, I cannot speak on behalf of everyone, but metals companies in general are not in favor of mandatory recycled content targets. Why is that? Because it is saying recycled content targets. It doesn't say EU recycled content. It doesn't say local content or something. If you impose recycled content targets on one continent, on one sector, you create a risk that it's opening the door for import of secondary materials from other parts of the world where they do have no targets, but also from product groups that also do not have recycled content targets. So you can use, for instance, cobalt, secondary cobalt coming from elsewhere, and use it to, for instance, in China, they have, of course, a lot of capacity in cobalt, and you use it to reach your EU recycled content, your recycled content targets, for instance, under the EU battery regulation. So we are really concerned about this recycled content targets, that it can have the opposite impact, not the idea in itself, because recyclers can do it. We as Umicore, we're also quite confident that we can do it. I would say that the general target at least, but it could have opposite outcomes. So we are not in favor of this recycled content targets. And if they are there, I think also important to mention is that we make sure that it's output allocation. Because again, the example of cobalt, you can have cobalt from different industries. Also in a refinery where you recycle, you have primary materials, you have secondary materials. The output needs to be on a mass balance base, on a credit base for specific customers. We cannot create separate lines or separate smelters for specific product groups or for specific customers that require recycled content. So I think that is something also when we have it, that we at least allow for this crediting, because that is more efficient. And yeah, once an atom is in this recycling plant, we cannot have the traceability of this atom afterwards. So to make it more efficient and to not duplicate infrastructure, that is also something important. So just already a few comments on this upcoming Circular Economy Act, that for us as Umicore definitely will be one of the key policy files for the new year.
Thank you. No, thanks a lot for expanding a lot on your views around Circular Economy Act. I mean, if I hear you correctly, especially when it comes to things like the single market and the transportation rules, it's really all about properly implementing and enforcing and simplifying what has been said for a long time, as opposed to basically new requirements.
Yeah.
We have about 5 minutes left, and I know we have received a few questions also from the audience. So I want to turn to my colleague Francisca now to kick us off with a few questions. Over to you.
Yes. Hi. Yeah. Thank you so much for the insights until now. And now we're going to move to the quick Q&A. So maybe a question to Julia from Joanne. He says, graphite is not included in the batteries regulation, but is potentially an even bigger bottleneck. Have you investigated this, or is this planned?
Yes, so I'm very happy to answer, but I would really also like to hear actually from Ruth whether or not at Umicore you recycle that. What I would say about graphite is that what we understand is up until, so it certainly has, especially primary graphite, that we use in batteries, certainly have a really big carbon footprint, that's for sure. And we do have data on this in our overall life cycle analysis that you can find on our website that we actually update every 2 years. However, the issue we've had so far is we haven't really had an efficient, effective, commercial, good recycling process from graphite. But this is changing. I understand there's been a lot of innovation. And the one thing that I would point out, I actually feel that this is another clean tech opportunity in Europe, because there's a number of European companies and startups that are really exploring and trying to scale graphite recycling. So in the future, adding this to the regulation can certainly have a European ecosystem on that. But Ruth, how do you see graphite recycling today? Is it something you do or plan to do? Maybe you can share with us a few thoughts here as well.
Of course, I am not working in our R&D department, so but of course we try to as much comply also with this batteries regulation, of which many of these targets are still also, of course, under development. I think that is maybe something I forgot to say, that it is already an uncertainty how we will exactly calculate the different recycling efficiency of the materials that are currently in it, which the details matter in the end for the engineering for a company like ours. So I would say no, we focus on the metals that are necessary from the batteries regulation. But I'm also very happy that it's not a question on graphite, but it is a question on lower value battery chemistries that TNE also has addressed in its report, that it's in favor of having also ambitious targets for other low value materials, because I think we always say in Umicore, if you would say it's a cheap material, so you don't have to recycle it. Imagine you would say the same thing from plastic cutlery. It's a cheap material, you don't have to recycle it. Everybody throws away it's plastic forks and knives. That's also not how we are organized as a society. So I think the targets are already ambitious, but we also need it, I think, for instance, for iron and phosphate, as you also support in the report. Thank you.
No, absolutely. More questions, Francisca?
So I don't see any more questions from the chat, but one thing that might be interesting to just complement the picture after all we've heard of what Europe needs to scale its recycling capacities is what maybe what do we need in the global dimension? So when we think about global partners, what is it what Europe should do to work together with global partners to build this resilient recycling system?
Ruth, maybe you first.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for batteries and for battery recycling, so the entire value chain, I think as an industry, but also as Umicore, we believe that it makes sense to have a more localized value chain. But the question is, what is local? Because you have, of course, automotive hubs in different parts of the world, so it makes sense to have it more, to keep it more local, but local can, of course, be a bit wider than only Europe. It can also be, for instance, Northern Africa, or I think that is possible. So I don't think it is needed that we, for instance, on battery waste, that we have really partnerships, for instance, to ship the waste from the other side of the world. I also from a CO2 perspective, this is maybe not ideal, while for other waste streams, such as electronic waste, this really makes sense because you need a very economy of scale and you cannot build a very big smelter for e-waste in every country of the world. So I think it depends on the critical raw material, but of course on expertise and on setting the standards. And I think that is also something that the battery regulation is doing, because in the end, every battery placed on the European market needs to comply with these standards. So we assume that other countries in the world will do it, but we might maybe also use the partnerships to also share know-how and maybe also technology transfers.
No, thanks a lot for that, Ruth. Maybe just as to add one sentence here, and then I also see that we are now out of time, so we will let you all after that go for the rest of your Friday. I think from the global perspective, that ultimately that the entire vehicle stock will be going more and more and eventually full electric, and batteries will play a huge role, lithium-ion batteries, in the entire world. So there will be regional recycling hubs everywhere from Africa to South America to Europe. So there is, I think, a big role for Europe to indeed support the capacities and technology transfers Ruth was saying in a lot of those global South countries. And it can be certainly one of the areas that we can help them with, given the strategic partnerships. But as TNE, we do also agree that right now the waste and materials that we have in Europe of the products we used, as much as possible, should be kept here to recycle and turned into new materials. And if we do lose them all today to many places where there is no currently recycling capacity, it's either an environmental problem or also a resilience problem to Europe. So while we need to support that capacities everywhere, ultimately it will be for local markets everywhere to recycle, as opposed to just one continent getting everyone's waste, recycling it for themselves and then selling it to everyone as a final product. So that's maybe a broad answer to that. Very good question. Thanks a lot, Franziska. So on this, I would like to close our webinar and our discussion. Thank you so much, Ruth, for joining us this morning and for sharing all of those insights. I do indeed agree that there's a lot of agreement between us as TNE and Umicore. So let's just make sure that now also the European Commission and others listen, as they are, I'm sure, busy drafting the Circular Economy Act over their Christmas break as they're sitting by Christmas trees and opening their presents. Thank you so much for all those that joined. I wish you all a great rest of the week, and also really happy holidays if you are almost there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.